The morning I got discharged from St. Michael's, I sat on the edge of that hospital bed for 23 minutes before I finally picked up my phone. My daughter had known about the surgery for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. I'd sent her the date, the hospital name, the floor number. I even told her what time the procedure was scheduled, 7 a.m., so she wouldn't have to rush. I'm not a man who asks for much. I spent 34 years working double shifts at a sheet metal plant so my kids could have what I didn't. I paid for my daughter's wedding. I co-signed on my son-in-law's truck. I never once asked either of them to repay me. But that morning, sitting there in a paper-thin hospital gown with a fresh incision down my sternum and a nurse waiting to wheel me out, I picked up the phone and typed into our family group chat. "Can anyone come get me? I'm being discharged this morning." 3 minutes passed, then 5. Then my son-in-law replied first. "We've got stuff going on today. Can't you just call a car?" I sat there staring at that message like I'd misread it. Stuff going on. I'd just had open heart surgery 4 days ago. Then my daughter's message came through, right underneath his. "Dad, an Uber is like $15. It's not a big deal." I put the phone down. I didn't reply. I just sat there looking at the window across the room. It was a grey November morning, the kind that makes everything look a little hopeless. And I thought, okay. Now I know exactly where I stand. I should back up, because this story didn't start in that hospital room. It started about 8 months earlier, when I made the mistake of agreeing to something I should have never agreed to. After my wife passed, her name was Ruth Ann, and she was the best person I ever knew. I spent about 2 years rattling around alone in the house we'd shared for 31 years. My daughter kept saying I should move closer to her. She and my son-in-law had a nice place out in Clarkfield, about 40 minutes from where I lived, with a spare room they never used. She wore me down eventually. I told myself it made sense. I was 63. My heart had been giving me trouble, and the winters were hard to manage alone. So I sold my house, put most of the money in a savings account, and moved into their spare bedroom. That was my first mistake. Things were fine for maybe the first month. My daughter cooked dinner some nights, my son-in-law and I watched football on Sundays, and I stayed out of their way as much as I could. I wasn't trying to be a burden. I cleaned up after myself, helped with the grocery runs, fixed the back fence and the kitchen faucet that had been dripping since before I got there. But somewhere around month 2, something shifted. It started small. My son-in-law started making comments at dinner. Little remarks about carrying extra weight around the house, about how utility bills had gone up. My daughter started asking questions about my finances. How much had I gotten for the house? What was in my retirement? Did I have a will? Was it updated? I told her I had a will and that everything was taken care of. She smiled and said she was just asking because she cared. But the questions kept coming, just dressed up differently each time. She asked if I'd considered putting her name on my savings account, just in case something happened. My son-in-law suggested I simplify my investments by consolidating everything with his cousin, who apparently did financial planning out of a strip mall in the next town over. I didn't say much. I just listened, and I started paying attention. Then my cardiologist found the blockage. "I need a triple bypass," he told me. "Not urgent enough to rush into it, but serious enough that we shouldn't wait more than a few months." When I told my daughter, the first thing she said was, "What happens to your accounts if something goes wrong during surgery?" "Not are you scared, Dad? Not do you want me to go to the appointment with you? What happens to your accounts?" That was the moment I stopped pretending I didn't see what was happening. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Walt. We've known each other for almost 20 years, went to the same church before I moved, and I trusted him more than just about anyone alive. I told him everything, the questions about the money, the pressure about the will, the suggestion about the cousin's financial planning business. Walt listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always liked about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a second and then said, "How do you want to handle this?" I told him I wasn't sure yet. I needed to think. "Take your time," he said, "but do me a favor and don't sign anything they put in front of you." Not a thing. I promised him I wouldn't. Over the next several weeks before the surgery, I had long conversations with Walt. I updated my will completely, not in the way my daughter was hoping. I also moved the bulk of my savings into a separate account she had no knowledge of, set up through a different bank entirely. I set up a small trust with Walt as the administrator. Everything was documented, everything legal, and everything was done quietly. I also bought a small security camera, the kind that looks like a smoke detector, and I put it in my bedroom. I want to be honest about why I did it. Part of me hoped I was wrong. Part of me wanted to look back at the footage someday and see nothing unusual, to feel embarrassed for being suspicious of my own daughter. That would have been fine with me. I would have been glad to be wrong. I was not wrong. The surgery went well, technically. I woke up in the ICU on a Tuesday afternoon with tubes in places I'd rather not describe, a nurse named Sandra checking my vitals, and a deep bone-tired feeling that I hadn't expected. Not pain exactly, but a heaviness, like my whole body had been wrung out like a dishcloth. Sandra told me the procedure had gone smoothly, that Dr. Reeves was pleased with how things looked, and that I'd probably be in the hospital for 4 to 5 days. My daughter visited once. The second day, for about 40 minutes, she brought a plant that I later found out was from the hospital gift shop downstairs. She sat in the chair beside my bed, asked how I was feeling, told me a few things about work, and then mentioned, carefully, like she'd been practicing the phrasing, that she and my son-in-law had been thinking it might be good, once I got settled back home, to sit down and go through my paperwork together. Just to make sure everything was organized. I told her that was a good idea. I smiled when I said it. She left before dinner. She didn't come back. On the 4th day, the discharge coordinator told me I'd be heading home the next morning. She asked me if someone would be there to pick me up. I told her yes, my family would be coming. I believed it when I said it. That next morning I sent the text, and I got the replies I already told you about. I sat in that hospital room for a while after that. The nurse, a young man named Trevor, couldn't have been more than 25, could tell something was off. He asked me if everything was okay with my ride. I told him I was going to need to make other arrangements. He offered to help me call a car service, and I thanked him, and I did it, and I didn't let him see how much it stung. The driver who came to get me was a heavy-set guy in a Chevy Equinox with an air freshener shaped like a pine tree and a radio tuned to an oldies station. He looked at me when I got in, slowly, carefully, the way you move when your chest still pulls with every step, and he said, "Somebody's picking you up on the other end, right?" "My daughter," I said. He nodded and put it in drive, and we didn't talk much after that, which was fine. I didn't feel like talking. I sat in the back seat watching the grey November scenery roll past, and I thought about Ruthann, which is what I always do when things get hard. I thought about what she would have said if she could have seen the last 8 months. I knew exactly what she'd say, actually. She would have seen through all of it long before I did. She always saw people more clearly than me. That was one of the many things I depended on her for without ever saying so, and losing it was like losing my compass. We pulled up to the house. The lights were on. My son-in-law's truck was in the driveway. My daughter met me at the door with a smile I'd seen before, the kind that comes out when she wants something warm on the surface, eyes going somewhere else. She hugged me, careful of my chest, and said she was so glad I was home. My son-in-law came out of the living room and shook my hand, said I looked good, said color was coming back to my face. I thanked them both. I let them help me to the couch. I let my daughter bring me a glass of water and a blanket and ask me if I was hungry. I watched. That's all I did for the next 3 days. I lay on that couch and I watched, and I kept my mouth mostly shut, and I let them think everything was fine. On the second evening, my son-in-law offered to carry my bag upstairs to my room. I told him that was kind of him. I'd already removed everything from the bag that mattered before I walked in the door. The documents I'd had Walt prepare were with Walt. The only things in the bag were clothes and toiletries and a paperback novel I'd bought from the hospital gift cart. But I watched from the couch as he took a little longer than he should have upstairs. 7 minutes. I counted. When he came back down, he said the room looked comfortable and asked if I needed anything else. I told him I was fine. I thanked him again. That night, I pulled out my phone and opened the security camera app. The camera in my room had picked up everything. My son-in-law went through my bag methodically, checked every pocket, unzipped the interior compartments, even checked inside the novel. When he didn't find what he was looking for, he went through the drawer of my nightstand. Then the small box on the dresser where I kept miscellaneous things, a watch, some change, a few old receipts. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. But now I had him on video. I should tell you what they were looking for because it matters to the rest of the story. About 2 years ago, before I'd had any real reason to be suspicious of anyone, I bought a Powerball ticket on a whim. I was at a gas station in Millbrook waiting behind a woman who was buying about 40 scratch-offs, and I figured, what the heck? I bought one ticket. I didn't win the jackpot. I wasn't that lucky, but I did win a second-tier prize that turned out to be worth a little over $140,000. I didn't tell many people. My attorney knew because I needed his help handling the tax paperwork. My neighbor Pete knew because he drove me to claim it and I swore him to secrecy. Other than that, I kept it quiet. I put the money in my account, set some aside for taxes, and went on with my life. What I didn't realize was that Pete, who is a good man, but not always careful about what he says after his second beer, had mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone, and somewhere down that chain, my daughter had heard about it. She never brought it up directly, but looking back, I could see the shift. The questions about my finances started right around then. The push to move in with them. The interest in my paperwork. They were looking for the claim receipt. The original documentation from when I claimed the prize. I kept a copy of it in my files, though the money had long since been deposited, and the receipt was just a paper record at that point. No more cashable than a grocery store coupon. But they didn't know that. They thought that paper represented unclaimed money. Let them think it. On the 4th day home, I told my daughter I was feeling well enough to sit in my armchair in the study. She helped me in there, got me settled, brought me coffee. The study is where I keep my books, my files, my things. It's where I've always done my thinking. She straightened up a few things on the desk, unnecessary little adjustments, and then mentioned, casually, that she'd noticed I had a lot of paperwork and that she'd be happy to help me go through it sometime, organize it, just make sure everything was in order. That'd be nice, I said. Maybe, this weekend. She lit up a little. She couldn't help it. What happened over the next 2 days was something I can only describe as watching two people I used to love turn into strangers in front of me. They went through my study bookshelf by bookshelf, file by file, with a thoroughness that would have impressed me if it hadn't been so devastating. They thought I was resting. I was watching through a crack in the door I'd left intentionally ajar. I let it run. I had another camera in the study. Same type, positioned behind a row of books. I'd installed it before the surgery. They found the copy of the claim receipt on the 3rd search, tucked inside a manila folder in the 2nd drawer of my filing cabinet. My daughter held it up and her hands were shaking. Her husband put his arm around her. They stood there in my study looking at that piece of paper like it was a treasure map. It was almost funny. It would have been funny if it didn't hurt the way it did. I called Walt the next morning. Told him everything was on camera. Told him they'd found the receipt. He wasn't surprised. We'd already put the plan in motion before the surgery, but now we had the documentation to back it up. What my son-in-law had done by going through my bag, and what both of them had done in the study, wasn't necessarily illegal in every sense of the word, but combined with everything else, it painted a clear and undeniable picture. And the picture mattered because I needed it for what came next. I called my daughter that morning from the study. She didn't know I could see her face on the camera when her phone rang. She was in the kitchen, and I watched her expression change when she saw my name on the screen. She put on the caring voice before she even answered. "Dad, are you okay? Do you need something?" I told her I was thinking about getting my paperwork sorted out, and I wondered if she and her husband would come sit with me this afternoon. I told her I wanted to go over the will. She said, of course, they'd be right in. They sat across from me at the study table, and I told them that I'd been doing a lot of thinking in the hospital. That when you're lying there after surgery, you think about legacy, about what you want to leave behind, about the people who matter to you. My son-in-law was nodding seriously. My daughter had her hands folded in her lap. I told them I'd already spoken with Walt, that I'd made some changes. My daughter said, "What kind of changes?" I said I was leaving the majority of my estate to a veterans foundation in Ruth Ann's name. She'd always wanted to do more for veterans' families. It seemed right. The room went quiet in a way I felt in my chest. My son-in-law said slowly, "The majority meaning most of it," I said. "The house will be sold, the accounts transferred. Walt has all the paperwork." My daughter looked at me for a long moment. Then she said with a careful thin-lipped smile, "Well, Dad, we'd love to see the paperwork, just so we understand." I told her Walt would be in touch. 2 days later I moved out. A friend from my old church, a man named Douglas who'd helped me move in 8 months earlier and had been quietly horrified at what I had described to him over the phone, came with his son and a rented truck. We loaded my things in under 3 hours. My daughter stood in the driveway watching and didn't say much. Her husband stood behind her with his arms crossed. I stopped at the foot of the driveway before I got in Douglas's truck. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She was 41 years old. I remembered the day she was born, the way she'd wrapped her whole fist around my index finger and held on. I had loved her without conditions for every year of her life since that day. "I know what you were looking for," I said. "I know about all of it." She opened her mouth. I raised a hand. "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me a little. "I'm just done. I got in the truck." Douglas pulled out of the driveway without a word. I stayed with Douglas and his wife for a few weeks while I recovered and while Walt finalized everything. It was a quiet, kind household. They fed me well and left me alone when I needed to think, which is all you can really ask of people. Walt sent the formal paperwork to my daughter at the end of the month. It wasn't a surprise. I'd told her what was coming. But seeing the actual documents made it real in a way that my words in the study hadn't. The trust was structured exactly as we'd set it up. The Veterans Foundation received the bulk of the estate with a small portion designated for my own care and living expenses, managed by Walt. My daughter and son-in-law received nothing. I know that sounds harsh. I've turned it over in my mind many times. But what they did wasn't a moment of selfishness or a bad day or a single lapse in judgment. It was 8 months of deliberate, patient scheming against a man who just had his chest opened up, against their own family. I didn't make the decision in anger, I made it in clarity, which is a different thing entirely. The phone calls started at 6:47 on a Wednesday evening. I know the exact time because I was sitting in Douglas's back room watching the evening news when my phone lit up on the end table beside me. My daughter, I let it ring, then my son-in-law, then my daughter again, then a number I didn't recognize. Turns out it was her friend, who'd apparently been deputized as a messenger. By 9 o'clock that night, I had 31 missed calls. By the next morning, 64. Over the following 3 days, the count reached 92. I answered twice. Both times I told them that Walt handled all matters related to the estate and that they were welcome to contact his office. Then I hung up. The third time I almost answered. I put the phone down and went and sat on Douglas's back porch in the cold instead, watching the bare trees at the edge of his yard, and I breathed carefully still, my chest still tender, and I reminded myself that I had made the right decision. My daughter left a voicemail on day 2 that I have listened to exactly once. She cried on it. Real tears, I think. Not the performative kind. Somewhere in the middle of it she said, "Dad, we never meant for any of this to go the way it did." Which is not the same as saying we didn't do it. I noticed that. After 34 years of reading people on a factory floor, you learn to hear what's in the gap between what someone says and what they mean. What she meant was, we didn't expect to get caught. I found a rental apartment in February, small, first floor. My doctor's orders until I was further along in recovery, in a town called Weston Mills, about 12 miles from where I'd lived before I ever made the mistake of moving in with my daughter. It had good light and a small torch off the back that caught the afternoon sun. My neighbor across the hall was a retired postal worker named Pete, different Pete from my lottery Pete, who turned out to know everything about college basketball and very little about everything else, which made him excellent company. He knocked on my door the second week with a plate of brownies his wife had made, said he'd heard I was recovering from something big, and asked if I needed anything. I told him I was fine, but I'd take the brownies. We watched 3 games together that first month. Recovery was slow. It always is after something like that. The physical part, the daily walks, the breathing exercises, the follow-up appointments was manageable. What was harder was the part nobody really warns you about, the grief. Not for the money or the house or even the situation, but for the version of my daughter I'd believed she was, for the relationship I thought we had. That took longer than my sternum to heal, but it did heal. That's what I want you to know. These things do heal. Walt called me in March with news I hadn't been expecting. In reviewing my records while setting up the trust documents, he'd found something I'd overlooked, an old 401A, from my first job at the plant. A small one, started when I was 26 and largely forgotten after I changed employers, had been sitting untouched for decades, quietly accumulating. The balance was a little over $78,000. I hadn't thought about that account in probably 15 years. I sat with that for a moment. Then I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a while. Walt laughed too, in his careful, understated way. "Funny how things work out," he said. I told him to add it to the trust. "You sure you don't want to keep some back for yourself?" "I'm fine," I told him. "I've got what I need." And I meant it. I had my porch in the afternoon sun. I had Douglas, who called every Sunday. I had my neighbor Pete and his wife's brownies. I had my health slowly returning. I had my memories of Ruth Ann, which nobody could touch and nobody could take. Whatever they'd been trying to get from me, whatever it was they thought that piece of paper in the filing cabinet was worth, they had missed the point entirely. The things that actually mattered had never been in any drawer. I'm telling you this not because I want sympathy. I've got enough, and not because I want you to think poorly of my daughter, though I understand if you do. I'm telling you this because I spent 63 years believing that if you work hard and love people honestly and ask for very little in return, it comes back to you somehow. And then one grey November morning, I sat in a hospital room with a fresh scar on my chest and got a text message that made me wonder if I'd been a fool for believing that my whole life. I don't think I was a fool. I think I trusted the wrong people, which is a different thing. And when I finally saw clearly, when I stopped explaining away what I was seeing and just looked at it directly, I made decisions that were right for me. Not cruel decisions, not impulsive ones, careful ones, legal ones, mine. That's what I want you to take from this if you take anything at all. It is not too late to make careful decisions, even after surgery, even at 63, even when the people who were supposed to show up for you didn't. I still get the occasional text from my daughter. Short ones, nothing like those first frantic calls. She asked in July if I wanted to have lunch. I told her I'd think about it. I haven't answered yet. Maybe someday I will. Maybe I'll find something still worth saving between us. I hold that possibility loosely, like something I'm not sure I want to grip too tight. But some evenings I sit on my back porch in Western Mills with a cup of coffee, and I watch the light go down behind the tree line, and I think about Ruth Ann. And I think about the long, strange road that brought me here, to this small porch and this quiet evening. And I think, I am okay. I am more than okay. I made it through, and I came out knowing exactly who I was. That's worth more than anything they were looking for in that filing cabinet. A lot more.